Even if you are just getting started with understanding how music works, you probably have at least heard the term scale before. Most music is based around a particular scale, and today I'm going to show you how you can find the two most common kinds of scales for any note, all with a simple formula. It's really easy, it's going to be straightforward, and you'll get a lot of use out of it. Let's get into it. Welcome back to Three Strings Music, where we celebrate growth together, both in music and in life. My name is Clayton Roberts, though most people just call me Dewie. Glad to have you back. Last week, we talked about the different note names and their relationships with one another. Well, today, we're going to take that information and apply it to something that is used all the time in music, scales. And before we get into talking about scales and whatnot, I'd like to give you a free gift. I put together a nice handy guide for you called the 30-Minute Music Basics, where you can learn all the things you need to know about music to get started in just 30 minutes. And you can always use it as a reference. It has terms that we're going over today, as well as other basic terms to understand, and it's just a nice little pocket guide to have anytime you need. And again, it's completely free as my gift to you. All you got to do is just go to threestringsmusic.com/basics to download it. Again, that's the number 3 stringsmusic.com/basics. All right, so to fully understand this, there are some terms that we should take a look at beforehand. Starting with the term key. Well, what is a key? Basically, a key is the scale of which a piece of music is based on. Examples of key names would be things like C major, B minor, E major, C sharp minor, A flat major, and B flat minor. This is a big part of why we talked about sharps and flats last week. We've already at least mentioned scales in this video, but what exactly are they? What makes them different from a key? Well, simply put, a scale is any set of notes in a specific order. Most scales have 7 notes and are within a particular key. See how they come together? Now, there are a bajillion different kinds of scales that you can learn and play around with, but the two most common types that you're going to see in many places are major scales and minor scales. Get used to these because, especially in Western music, there are a lot of songs that use these scales. Here is an example of one of these scales in action. This is called A major. So that's all well and good, but how do we know? How do we know that this is indeed A major and not just random ascending and descending notes that sound nice together? Well, to figure this out, we need to learn about half steps and whole steps. Starting with half steps, a half step, also known as a semitone, is the distance between a note and the very next note before or after it. It is the shortest distance that you can travel on a piano, a guitar, or whatever else. Basically, it would be the very next piano key or the very next guitar fret and so on. In order to demonstrate this on a piano, let's play a note here. This is G. Now, if we were to move one half step up, we would get to G sharp. And of course, you can go in the opposite direction with half steps. If you wanted to play a half step lower than G, you would get F sharp. Do you see what I mean when I said it's the shortest distance that you can travel? It's the very next key before or after what you just played. So those are half steps, but what is a whole step? Well, a whole step, also known as a tone, is 2 notes before or after the current note. A very easy way to remember this is simply 2 halves make a whole. In other words, 2 half steps make 1 whole step. Going back to the piano, if we play that G again, and then instead of playing the black key that's directly above it, we skip it, and instead play the very next white key, we would get A, which is 1 whole step above G. And if we wanted to play a whole step lower than this G, then all we would do is skip the black key that is directly before G, and instead play the white key that comes before it, in this case, F. So now that we've taken a look at what half steps and whole steps are, we can use that information to pick apart any major or minor scale that we need to. And to make things even better, there's a handy dandy little formula that we can use to find out either kind of scale. And here is that formula for major scales. So what do those W's and H's mean? Well, it's whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. In other words, if you pick any note and follow along with this formula in mind, you will play that note's major scale. So, with all of this in mind, let's go back to that A major scale I played earlier and pick it apart. So we're going to play the scale again, but this time with the formula on display. We start off with playing this A note, and as we look at this formula, it says that the next note in the scale is a whole step away. So in order to play that, we would skip over this black key and then play the next white key, which in this case would be B. And as you can see, the formula calls for another whole step. But before we get into that though, I do want to remind you of what we talked about last week with B and C and E and F only being a half step away from one another. With no skippable black key in between this time, I hope you can see why it was so important that we talked about that. So in order to play the next whole step in the scale, we would skip over that C and then arrive at C sharp. Now with the next note in the scale, you'll see that we arrive at our first half step. So this time, we're not going to skip over any keys. Instead, we're going to just play the very next note, which is, in this case, D. And as you can now see, we now have a trio of whole steps for the next 3 notes in the scale. So in order to play them, we would go from this D, skip over the black key above that, and then we arrive at E. Now from here, we're in the exact same situation that we were in earlier with B needing to skip over C for a whole step. So we would take this E, skip over the white key, which is F, and then play the very next key, which is F sharp. So this is interesting because with where we are right now, we now have black keys skipping over a white key instead of white keys skipping over a black key. In order to play the last whole step in this scale, we would skip over that white key and then we would arrive at the next black key, which is in this case G sharp. And to finish off the scale, we just need one more half step. So we would go from G sharp and play the very next note, which is A. And there you go. That's the A major scale. Cool. So let's take a crack at one more major scale. This time, let's use E major. Alright, so our first note of the scale is going to be E. To make the first whole step in the scale, we skip over that white key, F, and then we get to F sharp. The next whole step has us skipping over the white key, G, to get to the next black key, G sharp. Now we get to our first half step of the scale. So we go from this G sharp up to the very next key, which is the white key, A. And from there, we have that trio of whole steps. So we skip over the next black key, which would be A sharp, and now we arrive at B. Then the second to last whole step has us skipping over that white key, C, to get to the very next black key, C sharp. One more whole step, we go from C sharp, skipping over the white key, D, to get to the very next key, which is D sharp. And finally, the last part of this scale calls for one more half step, so we go to the very next key from D sharp up to E. And there you go. That's the E major scale. Okay, so as a recap with how to find the major scale of any note, you would play the note, skip a note, play the next note, skip a note, skip a note, skip a note, and then play the next note. In other words, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So that's how you would find the major scale. Now, let's take a look at the flip of that and check out the minor scale formula. Now don't worry, the same general idea is very much there, it's just the only major difference is that the half steps and the whole steps will now be in a different order. Let me show you what I mean. This time, to find the minor scale, you go whole half, whole, half, whole. In other words, whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, and whole step. See what I mean? It's still the same idea, just in a different order. Since we walked through 2 major scale examples, let's walk through 2 minor scale examples so you can get an idea of this. Let's start with G minor. So to kick off the scale, we start at G. With this scale's first whole step, we go from G, skipping over the next black key to get to A. Now here, we get to see the first difference between the two, and this is what helps make the minor scale the minor scale. Here we get our first half step sooner than we would in the major scale, so we go from A to play the very next black key directly above it, which would be B flat. Now comes our second whole step in the scale, so we go from this B flat to skip over the white key B to go to the very next key directly above it, which, if you remember, there is no black key in between, so the next key directly above B would be C. Our third whole step has us going from C, skipping over the black key above that, to get to D. And here is our second half step, where we go from D to the black key directly above it, E flat. Our second to last whole step has us going from this E flat, skipping over the white key to get to the very next white key, because again, there's no black key in between E and F, so we get to F. And now we need one more whole step to get to the last note of this scale. So we go from this F, skipping over the black key above that, to get to G. And that's the G minor scale. Hopefully by now, you've had your aha moment of how this all comes together. But just to be sure, let's go ahead and do one more scale together. This time, to close it out, we're going to do B minor. So to start the scale off, we play B. From there, we climb up to our first whole step, skipping over the white key directly after the B to get to the next black key, C sharp. Next comes the first half step in the scale, so from there, we just play the very next key. In this case, it would be the white key, D. And from there, the next whole step has us skipping over that black key to get to E. And from that E, we take another whole step, skipping over the white key after E to get to F sharp. The last half step in the scale takes us to the very next key, which in this case would be the white key, G. And from there, we skip over the next black key to get to the next whole step in our scale, A. And last but most certainly not least, we need one more whole step, so we skip over that last black key to get to the next white key, B. And there you go, the B minor scale. And as for a general recap on the minor scale, to find the minor scale of any note, you play the note, skip a note, play the next note, skip a note, play the next note, skip a note, and then skip a note. Like I said earlier, it's the same general idea as with the major scale, it's just that here everything is in a different order. So just some final thoughts before we close out today. Your quote-unquote homework is to go try these scales out for yourself. All you gotta do is just pick any random note on a piano or any other instrument you have and work through the formulas. You can do this with a piano, you can do it with a guitar, it doesn't matter. The main thing I want you to keep in mind, however, is to please go slow. There is no hurry with this, so please go at your own pace, work through it as many times as you need to, there's zero hurry. And one more time, don't forget the guide that I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the 30-minute music basics. It has pretty much everything we talked about today. It's got mentions of half steps, whole steps, and even the formulas for the major and minor scales that we use today. It's got that and plenty of other things, so please head on over to 3stringsmusic.com/basics to get your hands on this free guide. Again, that's the number 3stringsmusic.com/basics. Thank you again for joining me today. I hope you got some good use out of this, and I hope to see you on another video. In the meantime, have fun with this, stay safe, and have a wonderful day. I'll see you in a future video. Take care.